We are watching a slow-motion assault on US innovation finance. Choke the sales, starve the labs. That is not hyperbole. It is the logic of what has just unfolded. In late 2025, China imposed the strictest export controls on rare earths, permanent magnets, gallium, germanium, and antimony that the world has seen. Washington responded with expanded semiconductor export bans. Then, in November, both sides signed a one-year truce, a suspension, not a solution. Beijing agreed to issue general licenses for certain critical materials. Washington agreed to pause some retaliatory measures. The headlines called it a deal, but what it actually represents is a mutual strangulation dressed up as diplomacy. Both sides are tightening the noose on each other's industrial base, and the temporary reprieve does nothing to address the structural dependencies that make the strangulation possible in the first place. Worse, it creates political incentives to avoid the costly, decade-long industrial transformation that would actually break the trap. So let me be clear about the thesis. China's rare earth export controls and America's semiconductor restrictions form a dual chokehold that weakens both economies, locks in dangerous dependencies, and starves the financial and material base of innovation. The one-year suspension preserves leverage for both governments while deferring the hard choices. And in the meantime, manufacturers, workers, and research labs pay the bill. Let us start with what actually happened, because the timeline matters. This was not a sudden move. China began tightening rare earth export rules in December 2023, banning the export of extraction and separation technologies. In April 2025, 7 rare earth elements were formally listed under export controls. Then, on the 1st of December 2025, Beijing issued announcement number 61, the most stringent restrictions to date. Under these rules, any request for a license that involves military end use is automatically rejected. No negotiation, no exceptions. The message was unmistakable. If you are building defense systems, you will not get Chinese rare earths. This was not a trade spat. It was geopolitical siegecraft, calibrated to hit the supply chains of advanced electronics, electric vehicles, and defense contractors. And it worked. Manufacturers across the United States, Europe, and Asia reported immediate disruptions. Orders were frozen, shipments were delayed. Legal teams scrambled to interpret the new affiliation and trace content rules, which we will come back to, because they are the hidden mechanism that mainstream coverage almost entirely missed. Then came the November deal. The White House released a fact sheet describing what it called a reciprocal trade accord. China agreed to suspend some of those export controls and issue general licenses for certain critical materials to benefit US end users. In exchange, Washington agreed to suspend certain retaliatory measures for 1 year. The suspension was presented as a win, a de-escalation, a return to stability. But read the fine print. This is not a return to free trade. It is a managed permission regime. Licenses must still be applied for. End-user restrictions remain in place. And the entire arrangement expires in 12 months, conveniently timed to fall after the next US election cycle. In other words, both governments have created a political window in which they can claim to have eased tensions without actually dismantling the choke points. They have bought time, not solve the problem. And that matters, because the problem is not diplomatic, it is structural. So, what is the structure? Let us talk about the plumbing. Rare earth elements are not rare in the ground. They are rare in the supply chain. Mining them is one thing. Separating them, refining them, and turning them into high-performance magnets is another. And that entire value chain is geographically concentrated in China. Beijing controls the majority of global mining, the vast majority of separation and refining capacity, and nearly all high-grade permanent magnet production. This is not an accident. It is the result of decades of industrial policy, environmental trade-offs that other countries were unwilling to make, and strategic investment in downstream processing. The result is a choke point. If Beijing restricts exports, downstream manufacturers, whether they are making electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, smartphone speakers, or missile guidance systems, face immediate input shortages. And here is the kicker. Refining capacity outside China is limited and slow to scale. Building a new separation facility takes years. Qualifying new suppliers takes years. Training the workforce takes years. So even if you decide today that you want to diversify away from Chinese rare earths, you are looking at a multi-year transition during which you remain vulnerable. That is the trap. But the trap has another layer, and this is where the legal complexity comes in. China's December controls do not just restrict the export of rare earth ores or finished magnets. They restrict items with even trace Chinese content or affiliations. If a magnet was made in Japan, but uses rare earth powder that was refined in China, it may fall under the new rules. If a European manufacturer has a subsidiary that sources from a Chinese partner, that affiliation may trigger a license requirement. The result is a cascading compliance burden. Every link in the supply chain must now be audited. Every shipment must be documented. Every end use must be certified. And because the rules are new and the definitions are vague, legal uncertainty is high. Firms do not know whether a given transaction will be approved until they apply, and the application process itself is opaque. So even where physical supply exists, trade is deterred. Manufacturers delay orders. Investors pull back. And the entire system becomes more fragile, more expensive, and more politicized. Mainstream coverage talks about rare earth shortages as if they were a simple supply and demand problem. They are not. They are a legal and institutional problem engineered to maximize leverage. Now let us turn the lens around, because the United States is playing the same game. Washington has expanded its semiconductor export controls dramatically over the past 2 years. The Bureau of Industry and Security has widened the entity-based blacklist, adding hundreds of foreign affiliates and tightening restrictions on advanced chips, lithography equipment, and design software. The stated goal is to prevent China from acquiring the technology needed for military AI and advanced computing. But the mechanism works both ways. When you ban the sale of high-end GPUs and AI accelerators to Chinese customers, you are not just denying Beijing access to technology. You are cutting off revenue streams for American firms. NVIDIA, AMD, Intel, and others have lost billions in China sales over the past 2 years. And here is what that means in practice. Less revenue means smaller R&D budgets. It means fewer engineers, It means slower innovation cycles. It means that the very firms Washington is trying to protect are being financially weakened by the protection itself. Meanwhile, competitors in Japan, South Korea, and increasingly within China itself are capturing the market share that US firms have been forced to vacate. So the policy achieves its security goal, maybe, but at the cost of commercial leadership. And because innovation in semiconductors is expensive and cumulative, today's lost revenue becomes tomorrow's lost capability. So who pays for all of this? Not the executives, not the shareholders. They can shift capital, restructure portfolios, and collect severance packages. The people who pay are the workers on the factory floor, the engineers in the R&D labs, and the supply chain managers trying to keep production lines running. When input costs rise because you have to stockpile rare earths or qualify alternate suppliers, that comes out of operating budgets. When the revenue falls because you have lost access to the Chinese market, that comes out of headcount. When compliance costs explode because every shipment now requires a legal review, that comes out of investment in new products. The pain is distributed downward and outward. Manufacturers across the United States, Europe, and Asia are now spending more on buffer stocks, redundant supply chains, and legal fees. Capital that could have gone into automation, training, or innovation. And the workers who depend on those investments are the ones who lose. This is not an abstract geopolitical chess game. It is a material transfer of resources from productive activity to risk management, and the people at the bottom of the income distribution are the ones who bear the cost. Let me give you some historical context, because we have been here before. In the 1970s, the oil shocks forced the industrialized world to confront its dependency on Middle Eastern crude. The initial response was panic, price controls, and diplomatic scrambling. But the long-term response was structural. Investment in energy efficiency, diversification of supply, strategic petroleum reserves, and eventually a shift toward alternative energy sources. That transformation took decades. It required sustained public investment, industrial policy, and political commitment that survived multiple election cycles. And it worked. Not because any single deal was struck, but because the underlying infrastructure was rebuilt. The rare earth dependency we face today is analogous. Temporary diplomatic deals, like the one-year suspension signed in November, can lower the immediate temperature, but they do not replace the need for long-term industrial transformation. Building domestic refining capacity, scaling up magnet production, and securing alternative supply chains will take years, billions in capital, and consistent policy support. And here's the problem. One-year suspensions do not create that kind of commitment. They create the opposite. They create an incentive to wait, to hope the problem goes away, to avoid the politically costly investments that would actually solve it. So why do both sides keep playing this game? Because it serves their institutional interests. Let us talk about power. Both Beijing and Washington are using export control bureaucracies, licensing regimes, entity lists, and use restrictions to project geopolitical influence. These are not market mechanisms. They are administrative tools that turn private firms into compliance subjects. When China issues announcement number 61, it is not just restricting the flow of rare earths. It is asserting the state's authority to decide who gets access to critical inputs and on what terms. When the United States expands its entity-based blacklist, It is doing the same thing, asserting the right to control the flow of technology based on political criteria. And here is the key. Regulatory complexity is a feature, not a bug. The more complicated the rules, affiliation tests, trace content thresholds, dual-use definitions, the more discretion the state has. It can turn the dial up to signal displeasure, turn it down to reward cooperation, and leave just enough ambiguity that firms stay cautious. This is governance through uncertainty. And it works, because firms cannot afford to guess wrong. So they overcomply, they pull back from borderline transactions, they invest in compliance infrastructure instead of new products. The result is that both governments gain leverage and both industrial bases become less dynamic. But there is another reason the game continues. Neither side wants full decoupling. Permanent restrictions are costly. If China cuts off rare earth exports entirely, it loses export revenue and damages its own downstream industries that depend on foreign customers. If the United States bans all semiconductor sales to China, it cripples its own tech sector and hands the market to competitors. So both sides prefer episodic leverage, temporary restrictions that signal resolve, extract concessions, and preserve the option to escalate or de-escalate as needed. The one-year suspension fits this logic perfectly. It allows both governments to claim they have eased tensions. It buys time for domestic political narratives, and it keeps the underlying choke points intact so they can be used again when convenient. This is not peace. It is managed confrontation. And the cost of that management is borne by the firms and workers caught in the middle. The spillover effects are global. European manufacturers, Japanese electronics firms, South Korean battery makers, they all face a dual squeeze. On one side, they depend on Chinese rare earths and other critical inputs. On the other side, they want to sell into the US market and comply with US export controls. So they are forced to navigate overlapping restrictions, audit their supply chains for Chinese content, and constantly assess political risk. And when US firms are blocked from selling to China, the market share does not disappear. It goes to competitors who are not subject to the same restrictions. Japanese semiconductor equipment makers, European chemical suppliers, and increasingly Chinese domestic firms are capturing the business that American companies have been forced to abandon. So the policy achieves its goal of denying technology to Beijing, but it does so by weakening US commercial leadership and strengthening everyone else. That is not strategy. That is self-harm dressed up as security. Meanwhile, firms are adapting. They are stockpiling rare earths. They are qualifying alternate suppliers in Australia, Canada, and Vietnam. They are investing in new refining facilities and magnet production lines outside China. All of this is rational risk management. But it is also expensive. Stockpiling ties up capital. Qualifying new suppliers takes time and money. Building new facilities requires years of lead time and massive upfront investment. So the near-term effect is higher costs, lower margins, and less capital available for innovation. The long-term effect, if these investments succeed, is a more diversified and resilient supply chain. But that is a big if. It depends on sustained policy support, patient capital, and the willingness to accept higher costs for the sake of security. And it depends on governments not changing their minds every 12 months. Now, let me steelman the counter-argument, because there is one. Defenders of the November deal will say, yes, it is temporary, but it buys time. Time for the United States to invest in domestic rare earth refining. Time for allied partnerships to mature. Time for the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act to deliver new capacity. Time to avoid an immediate crisis while building long-term resilience. And there is some truth to that. Public-private partnerships, subsidies, and coordinated industrial policy can, over time, reduce dependency on Chinese inputs. The United States has the capital, the technology, and the institutional capacity to build alternative supply chains, if it commits to doing so. So the argument goes, use the diplomatic pause wisely, invest heavily, and emerge stronger. But here is the rebuttal. Political cycles do not align with industrial timelines. Building a rare earth refining facility takes 5 to 7 years. Scaling up magnet production takes longer. Training a workforce, establishing quality standards, securing environmental permits, all of this takes time. But 1-year suspensions are timed to election cycles, not industrial cycles. They create political incentives to declare victory, move on to the next headline, and avoid the costly, unglamorous work of building infrastructure. When the suspension expires, what happens? If tensions have eased, there is no urgency to invest. If tensions have escalated, it is too late. The choke points are still there, and you are back in crisis mode. Either way, the structural problem persists. And that is the trap. Temporary stability rewards short-term thinking. It allows both governments to avoid the hard choice between short-term affordability and long-term security. And in the meantime, the dependency remains, the leverage remains, and the risk remains. So what does all of this mean? It means we are watching the slow strangulation of innovation finance. On one side, US semiconductor firms are losing revenue because they cannot sell to China. That lost revenue translates directly into smaller R&D budgets, fewer new products, and slower technological progress. On the other side, US manufacturers are facing higher input costs and supply disruptions because they depend on Chinese rare earths. Those higher costs squeeze margins, reduce investment, and make it harder to compete globally. Both mechanisms point in the same direction. Less money available for long-term innovation. And that is the real crisis. Not the headlines about export bans. Not the diplomatic theater of 1-year suspensions. The crisis is that the financial and material base of technological progress is being eroded by a dual chokehold that neither side is willing to dismantle. So, what should you watch? 3 things. First, watch whether the 1-year suspension is renewed or allowed to expire after the next election. Renewal signals continued limbo. Expiration signals escalation. Either way, it tells you whether the political will exists to move beyond managed confrontation. Second, watch for concrete investment announcements, not press releases, but actual capital commitments in rare earth refining, magnet production, and alternative supply chains in the United States and allied countries. If those investments materialize and are sustained over multiple years, it signals a structural shift. If they do not, it signals that the dependency will persist. Third, watch for Chinese moves to tighten controls on other critical materials, tungsten, cobalt processing, lithium refining. China has already shown a willingness to escalate in stages. If new materials are added to the restricted list, it signals that Beijing sees episodic leverage as a winning strategy and will continue to use it. Let me close with this. A manufacturing crisis is not solved by licenses and press releases. It is not solved by one-year suspensions timed to election cycles. It is solved by public investment, industrial strategy, and the political courage to choose long-term security over short-term market access. That means building the refining capacity, the magnet production, the supply chain infrastructure that makes dependency obsolete. It means accepting higher costs in the near term for the sake of resilience in the long term. And it means recognizing that the current system, managed confrontation, episodic leverage, temporary truces, serves the interests of governments that want flexibility and firms that want to avoid costly restructuring. But it does not serve the interests of workers, engineers, or the broader public that depends on a functioning industrial base. So ask yourself, who benefits from a one-year truce that locks in dependency? And who pays the price when the clock runs out?